Today we're going to unpack something I think a lot of you have been wanting to learn more about India's relationship with the Gulf region. It's complex and vital and constantly changing, and we're going to really try and understand all of that today. We're going to explore an in-depth editorial analysis that looks at how this relationship is evolving and why it matters so much, even as the world is kind of shifting towards renewable energy.
Yeah, it's what's fascinating about this relationship is that it has these deep roots, going back centuries. But at the same time, it's being reshaped by these new economic realities, global power shifts, and even climate change. So it's really a great case study in how countries are adapting to a rapidly changing world.
Before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview of what we're even talking about when we say the Gulf region?
Sure, geographically, the Gulf region refers to the area surrounding the Persian Gulf. It includes countries like Bahrain, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This region is incredibly significant for a number of reasons.
And one of the biggest reasons that immediately comes to mind is oil.
Absolutely. The Gulf sits on a massive 6.5% of global oil reserves. That's enough to power the world for a significant period of time. And it's why the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, is considered such a crucial choke point for global energy transportation.
That's a pretty powerful position to be in. Control of that strait basically means control over a significant portion of the world's oil supply.
Exactly. And that brings us directly to India's energy needs. India relies on the Gulf for a whopping 55.3% of its crude oil imports. Even as India diversifies its energy sources, the Gulf remains absolutely critical for its energy security.
So even with this big global push for renewables, oil is still the lifeblood of this relationship.
Yeah, in many ways, yes, but it's becoming much more than that. It's expanding into areas like trade, investment, defense, and even cultural exchange. The Gulf is actually India's largest regional trading partner, accounting for a significant 15.8% of India's total trade. We're talking billions of dollars in everything from infrastructure development to technology partnerships.
I remember reading about the Vande Bharat mission during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. India brought home millions of its citizens from the Gulf, and it really struck me how deep that connection is.
That's a great example of how intertwined these two regions are. There are an estimated 8.8 million Indians living and working in the Gulf, sending back billions of dollars in remittances annually. This diaspora has a significant impact on both the Gulf economies and on families back in India. It adds a whole other layer to this relationship.
So we're seeing a multifaceted relationship here, driven by these energy needs, but also shaped by economic partnerships and deep people-to-people ties. But as we know, things are never that simple, right?
You're absolutely right. This relationship is constantly evolving, and with that evolution come a whole new set of challenges that both India and the Gulf countries need to navigate.
And I think that's a great place to transition because I really want to start digging into what those challenges are. But we're going to have to save that conversation for part 2 of this deep dive. So make sure you tune back in so we can unpack all of that. See you soon.
See you then. One of the most interesting aspects of this evolving relationship is how it's starting to move beyond that traditional narrative of oil dependency. We're seeing India and the Gulf countries diversifying their partnerships, branching out into new sectors.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what that diversification looks like in practice?
Absolutely. Take, for instance, the Ratnagiri refinery project. It's a massive $44 billion joint venture between India and Saudi Arabia. This signifies a shift from a simple buyer-seller dynamic to one of deeper collaboration, and it has big implications for India's long-term energy security goals.
So it's not just about buying oil anymore. It's about working together to develop energy resources and infrastructure.
Exactly, and that collaboration is expanding into other areas as well. We're seeing a rise in exports of made-in-India automobiles to Gulf countries, and even something like the 2024 IPL auction being held in Saudi Arabia points to a deepening cultural exchange.
That's fascinating. Who would have thought cricket would become a bridge between these two regions? It really shows how this relationship is branching out.
Yeah.
But you mentioned challenges earlier. What are some of the potential friction points that could impact this relationship?
Well, geopolitical alignments can be tricky. India has strong ties with Israel, and that can sometimes create tension with some Gulf nations that are sensitive to the Palestine issue. For example, India's neutral stance during the 2023 Hamas-Israel conflict, specifically abstaining from a UN ceasefire resolution, didn't sit well with some of its Gulf partners.
So even though India supports a two-state solution in principle, This particular action strained some of its relationships in the Gulf.
Yes, it highlighted the complexities of maintaining strong ties with countries that have differing viewpoints on such a sensitive and volatile issue. It's a delicate balancing act for India.
And on top of those geopolitical tensions, I imagine the energy landscape is also becoming more complex.
You're right. India's increased reliance on Russian oil imports after the Ukraine war has definitely shaken things up a bit. Even though Middle Eastern oil imports have rebounded somewhat, Russia is now a significant player in India's energy mix.
So India is diversifying its oil sources, but that diversification might be creating new challenges in its relationship with the Gulf.
Precisely. And as India continues to invest heavily in renewable energy, partnering with countries like Japan and Australia on green hydrogen, the Gulf's traditional dominance in India's energy landscape could weaken even further.
That makes sense. It seems like India is hedging its bets, so to speak, trying to secure its energy future from multiple sources. But this must be creating some uncertainty for the Gulf countries.
It certainly is. And that uncertainty is compounded by the stalled negotiations over a free trade agreement between India and the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC. The GCC, by the way, is a political and economic alliance of 6 Gulf countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. They've been trying to hammer out this trade deal for years, but there are major disagreements over things like tariff reductions and how to diversify trade beyond just oil.
So even though trade with the GCC makes up a sizable chunk of India's total trade, there are still roadblocks preventing them from reaching their full potential.
Yes, and those roadblocks are creating frustration on both sides. Another point of tension is the impact of Gulf nationalization policies like Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and the UAE's Emiratization program. These policies are designed to reduce those countries' dependence on foreign workers and create more job opportunities for their own citizens.
But with 8.8 million Indians living and working in the Gulf, those nationalization policies must be causing some anxiety.
Absolutely. There are concerns about the potential impact on the livelihoods of those Indian workers and the billions of dollars they send back home in remittances. And let's not forget about the security challenges. The Gulf's proximity to conflict zones like Yemen has led to issues with illegal arms and drug trafficking spilling over into India's maritime borders.
I remember reading about a Pakistani boat intercepted off the coast of Gujarat, carrying a large cache of weapons, ammunition, and narcotics. That's a worrying sign.
That incident really highlighted the need for stronger security cooperation between India and its Gulf partners. Despite India's efforts to monitor those crucial maritime choke points, they can't do it alone. They need to work together to address these shared security threats. And then there's the food security angle.
What do you mean by the food security angle?
Well, the Gulf nations rely heavily on food imports, and India is a major supplier of staple foods like rice and wheat. But India has occasionally imposed bans on exports of these commodities due to domestic concerns like inflationary pressures or drought.
I recall India having to restrict rice exports in 2023 to manage rising food prices.
Exactly. And that created uncertainty and disruption in the Gulf's food supply chains. It highlights the need for a long-term stable food trade agreement that benefits both Indian farmers and Gulf consumers.
So it sounds like there are a lot of hurdles to overcome in this relationship. But I'm sure there are also opportunities for greater cooperation. What does the future hold for India and the Gulf?
Despite all these challenges, there's actually a lot of potential for deeper collaboration and a more resilient partnership. Both sides recognize the importance of this relationship, and there are several areas where their interests align.
Well, let's dive into those opportunities then. What are some of the ways India and the Gulf countries can strengthen their ties and build a more mutually beneficial relationship?
One of the most promising areas is in the energy sector, but with a twist. We're talking about moving beyond that traditional buyer-seller relationship in oil and embracing a new model of co-development in renewable energy.
That sounds like a win-win. How would that work in practice?
Imagine Gulf sovereign wealth funds, which are basically huge investment funds controlled by these countries, pouring investments into India's renewable energy infrastructure. They could finance massive solar and wind projects,
Oh, wow.
helping India achieve its ambitious renewable energy targets while giving Gulf states a stake in a rapidly growing sector.
That's a smart way to align their interests and create a more sustainable energy future for both regions.
Yeah.
What about trade? We talked earlier about those stalled free trade agreement negotiations.
Yeah, that's another key area where they need to make progress. Finalizing that FTA with the GCC would unlock a huge amount of potential in sectors like pharmaceuticals, food processing, and technology.
India is already a global powerhouse in pharmaceuticals and IT, Could we see Indian companies setting up manufacturing hubs in the Gulf or joint ventures to develop new technologies?
Absolutely. And on the flip side, Gulf countries could invest in India's booming startup ecosystem, creating a mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and capital.
And while they're at it, maybe they could establish some long-term frameworks for food trade, ensuring a reliable flow of rice and wheat to those import-dependent Gulf nations, while providing Indian farmers with stable markets.
That's a crucial point. A stable food trade agreement would address those concerns about supply disruptions and price volatility, creating a more secure food future for both sides. Another area with immense potential is maritime and logistics infrastructure.
Given their strategic location, the Gulf countries are already major hubs for global shipping. How could they collaborate with India in this domain?
They could work together to build those resilient and efficient maritime corridors connecting India, the Middle East, and Europe. Imagine joint logistics hubs in key Gulf ports, streamlining supply chains and boosting trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe.
That would be a game changer for global trade. And it seems like there's also room for much closer cooperation on security issues.
Absolutely. We talked about those shared security threats earlier. They need to enhance their defense and security partnerships, including things like joint naval task forces to protect those vital choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and combat piracy in the Gulf of Aden.
So a more coordinated approach to maritime security. And what about cybersecurity, given that both regions are increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks?
That's another area where collaboration is essential. They need to develop cybersecurity pacts to share intelligence, build capacity, and counter those ever-evolving cyber threats. It's about pooling their resources and expertise to tackle these shared security challenges.
And let's not forget about that 8.8 million strong Indian diaspora. It seems like there's a huge opportunity to leverage that connection even further.
You're right. Establishing something like a Gulf India Expatriate Council could go a long way in addressing issues like employment, remittances, and labor rights. It would provide a platform for dialogue and ensure the well-being of those Indian workers while also strengthening those people-to-people ties.
It sounds like a win-win. And on the economic front, they could promote bilateral agreements for skilled worker mobility, focusing on sectors like healthcare and technology, where Gulf nations face shortages.
Precisely. That would address those skill gaps in the Gulf while providing opportunities for skilled Indian professionals. And speaking of healthcare, there's immense potential for collaboration in pharmaceuticals. India is a global leader in generic medicines and vaccines.
Could we see joint ventures to produce those affordable medications in the Gulf, perhaps even creating pharmaceutical hubs that could supply the entire region?
That's certainly within the realm of possibility. Imagine streamlined regulatory approvals for Indian pharmaceutical exports and joint production facilities that could lower costs and increase access to those life-saving medications.
That would be a game changer for healthcare access in the Gulf and beyond. We've talked a lot about economic and security cooperation, but what about addressing shared challenges like food and water security?
Those are crucial areas where they can work together. They could partner on agri-tech solutions using Indian expertise in crop diversification and Gulf funding to boost food production in the region.
And with water scarcity being a major concern for both India and the Gulf countries, they could co-develop those desalination and water conservation technologies to ensure a more sustainable water future.
Yeah.
And of course, climate change is a looming threat that requires a global response.
Absolutely. Establishing a Gulf India Sustainability Forum could be a powerful mechanism for co-investing in renewable energy, carbon capture, sustainable agriculture, and those cutting-edge climate technologies that are emerging. It's about aligning their climate goals and working together to build a more sustainable and resilient future.
So it's a multifaceted approach, tackling those complex challenges and seizing the opportunities that lie ahead. It sounds like there's so much potential for a deeper, more strategic partnership.
There is. But it will require a commitment to dialogue, a willingness to adapt, and a shared vision for the future. India's relationship with the Gulf region is a microcosm of the complexities of our globalized world. It's a reminder that in today's interconnected world, collaboration, not confrontation, is the key to navigating the challenges and seizing the opportunities that lie ahead.
That's a great takeaway. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of the nuances and complexities of this relationship. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you found this deep dive illuminating out. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the resources we mentioned. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share with your friends and leave us a review. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.